This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
We are back with another fun-filled episode of Art of Darkness, your favorite podcast about the dark side of the dark side of artists.
And the crowd goes wild.
Thank you. So, Kevin, I'm Brad Kelly. This is Kevin Kautzman. Kevin, how are you doing?
I am doing super. Spring has sprung in beautiful St. Paul, Minnesota. And I am ready to podcast in the middle of the afternoon. Usually we do this in the evening. Yeah.
We're going intercontinental, though.
Podcast. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Who do we have? Who's joining us?
We have friend of the show, Heghoulian, who joined us to talk about Kafka some time back. And he has he's returned to help us discuss a writer from England, and I'm not going to say anything more, Kevin, because I'm going to, and we'll throw it to Heghoulian here in a moment. But we got to start with our first question. We're talking about Robert Aickman. Kevin, what do you know about Robert Aickman?
Not a thing. I know his name is Robert Aickman, and he is a writer. I have seen on your fabulously curated Bird website account for Art of Darkness at Art of Dark Pod.
That's awesome.
I have seen you put up bits and bobs, but I have sort of on purpose I've looked away because I want to come in cold because that's part of the fun of this show.
Correct.
Depending on the episode, you bring the subject to me and I get to play the foil and vice versa. And in this case, I get to have an education almost from scratch. So
Excellent.
I'm very excited.
Excellent. I kind of knew that was the case. And so in our conversations that we were having about this, that, and the other leading up to this, I tried to avoid spoiling it for you. What you do know about him is correct, though. Yes, he is a writer. I'm going to throw it. I'm going to let Heghoulian tell us who this guy is. Who is Robert Aickman?
Okay, thanks for that intro, Brad. Yeah. And thanks for inviting me back.
Of course, and I should have given you a more proper introduction. Heghoulian is one of my favorite Twitter follows, by the way, and not only mine, but the favorite Twitter follow of many people. Follow him at Heghoulian. Of course, we'll have the links. He has a wonderful Substack that you should be digging into. One of the most incisive commentators on, any matters in which terminally online people like to dip their toes. So thank you for coming and spending some time with us and enlightening us on this matter.
Okay, my pleasure.
Yeah.
So about Aickman then, Robert Aickman, he was born in 1914. He was an English writer. He's famous for his, what he called strange stories. And he wrote about quite a lot of them, about 48, I think, strange stories over the course of about 30 years, from about 1950 to 1980. He died in 1981. And I first discovered him, it was about 6 years ago. And it's kind of curious that I only discovered him then, because I've always been interested in kind of the weird, really, weird stories. And weird fiction. I read Lovecraft when I was about 18. So I don't know why I never discovered Aickman until recently, really. But anyway, what are his stories about? Well, one of the first stories I read by Aickman got the title of The Swords. Now, Aickman himself was a kind of upper middle class fella, really, with I would say, opinions and tastes, to match that. And he also moved in some kind of aristocratic circles. But the Swords is rather based on a sort of a lower middle class or working class milieu. And it's about a young man. We don't know exactly when the story is set, but it seems to be maybe the 60s, I guess, early 60s perhaps. It's about a young man who goes into a family business, and he's working for his uncle, sort of doing a lot of traveling around the country selling his uncle's vegetables. And he gets sent in the story to Wolverhampton. If you've ever been to Wolverhampton, but it's in the Midlands. It's a kind of...
It is a real place.
It's a real place.
Okay.
It's a sort of provincial town, and if you know provincial towns in England, they can be rather dreary and sort of forlorn places. No offense to any listeners.
Yes. Rains an awful lot.
Yeah. But anyway, he gets sent on these journeys. He gets sent to various kind of boardings, sort of bed and breakfast type affairs, which he suspects the women who run these establishments are his uncle's, fancy women, as they used to say.
Okay.
But anyway, he gets to Wolverhampton, and he's kind of very bored. He calls himself, I think, green as a spring onion. He doesn't know anything about that, but and so I'll call him our spring onion. And so our spring onion heads out into the Wolverhampton one evening, and he's wandering about the kind of the rundown part of the town, and he chances upon a sort of traveling fair. It's quite small, near a canal and a few factories, and there's hardly anyone there, just a few kids hanging about. He's kind of intrigued a little bit by this fair. He wanders in, and he finds a sort of a tent there, very dirty looking kind of canvas flap, which you can sort of pull back, and there's a young man there, inviting him in, and there's a sign up which says the Swords. That's the kind of what's inside, the Swords, and that's it. That's all it says. So he goes in, and I'm not just going to give you the brief sketch of what happens in the story, but it's a kind of like a novelty act inside, where there's a young woman up on the stage, and she's kind of pretty, but she looks ill. She's kind of sat on a chair, very pale, and with some sort of ghastly green powder. And she's been sort of, I don't know, introduced to the audience by this kind of burly seaman-looking fellow, like a middle-aged seaman. And in the audience is he counts them as exactly 7 men, kind of like seedy-looking men in the audience, just sort of scattered about on chairs. And there's a pile of swords in front of the stage, about 30 or 40 swords. So our spring onion sits down, and he's watching the show, and the seaman invites somebody to come up and take a first turn. And this seaman is rather, as he says, kind of truculent, like he wants to pick a fight almost, it seems, with the audience. So it's got this kind of wonderful sort of seedy atmosphere, really, the whole story, but in particular this novelty act, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And so they come up. One of them comes up, and after much kind of encouragement and cajoling by this seaman, and he's invited to pick up a sword and stick it in this girl. Of course, he doesn't want to do it immediately.
Yeah, that's ghastly. That's terrible.
But anyway, he eventually does. This man, not our hero, but this other man.
Right.
And our hero, our spring onion, he says he hears very distinctly the sound of this ghastly sound of the sword going in and then coming out again, but he can't see any blood. And anyway, it carries on like that with a number. Also, by the way, I should say that every man gets a chance to kiss the girl afterwards. So they become much more enthusiastic after this, obviously.
Right.
But our spring onion decides to leave, actually, before it's his turn. I won't go into more of the story, but anyway, this gives you an idea of the flavor of the story. That it's kind of a story about the inexplicable and about aspects of British life, you might say, kind of like a social milieu here, social classes. Aspects of that which obviously Aickman observed with a keen eye, kind of given a very surreal twist, really. And this, I can talk a bit more about some other stories, but this is kind of the essence of Aickman for me, that his stories are about the kind of impossibility, in a way, of understanding the world, really, in the final analysis.
That's something that stuck out to me, like with Aickman, as opposed to somebody like Lovecraft, who you mentioned, and is sometimes kind of, they're put in a similar lineage. Lovecraft stories, once you buy into the preconceptions or the precepts of a Lovecraft story, they make sense.
Right.
Stories don't necessarily make sense. You're very much left with this, like, wait, what?
It's like like pure metaphor or a symbol. It reminds me of Lynch. Yeah. It reminds me of the Elephant Man somehow.
It's very, I would say it's very Lynchian, but that would be my experience with a bit of an English flair, I think, if that's fair to say, like a little bit more. If Lynch were born in London, these are the kinds of things he might have come up with the same brain,
Yes. I mean, Aickman was very English for sure, and he. This is another aspect of his stories, I think, is the kind of the attention to detail of the sort of spirit of place. He wants to try and capture those places, as I say, Wolverhampton in the Midlands. By the way, I first encountered this story through Reese Shearsmith's wonderful audiobook versions.
Okay.
And he really brings it to life. I mean, it's already a brilliant story, but the way he does, the kind of the voices of some of the characters as well is excellent. If you don't know Reese Shearsmith, he was he became most famous, I guess, for his involvement in the League of Gentlemen, which was a British comedy series of the late 90s, which itself is a bit Aickman-esque. It's kind of set in a northern town, it's a fictional town called Royston Vasey, where everyone is a kind of grotesque freak.
I think I came across the League of Gentlemen, which I wasn't aware of in my research, and that gentleman too. Yeah, he's certainly, Aickman has certainly left a little. There's a bit of an echo of him, I think, and maybe his career is kind of resurging. Well, he's passed, but attention. He's one of these people who's being somewhat rediscovered, it seems like.
I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, in the past sort of half decade, maybe he has become to the attention of a lot more people.
Yeah.
A couple of the other stories then I could mention. The most famous probably is called The Hospice, which was turned into a little film, I think, a BBC film, which you can find on YouTube.
It's pretty good, actually. I watched it. It's actually not bad.
Yeah, it's pretty decent. The Hospice is about businessman. Now, in all of Aickman's stories, they kind of start off in a very kind of normal, sequence of events, really, which suddenly kind of takes a turn for the strange, kind of things. The conventional order suddenly breaks down in some way, which is almost never explained, really.
Right.
So we have a businessman who leaves his premises, or he's either a businessman or a white-collar worker. Anyway, he leaves his premises on the way. I think he's going home, but he's advised that there's some kind of shortcut. So he's driving. And anyway, this shortcut leaves him lost, of course, as the light is fading away, failing.
No Google Maps available on his phone. Yeah. He's just wandering around the motorway. Yeah.
He ends up in some kind of residential, streets where the houses are set well back from the road. He gets out. I think he wants to kind of try to get his bearings. Starts walking. So it's already dark. And a cat kind of springs out at him and scratches him quite badly on the leg. And he starts to feel a bit faint. Then he tries to look for some kind of place to stay for the night, and he chances upon this kind of, I don't know, inn, I guess, which is, the hospice of the title. He goes in there, and he notices that it's very hot in there, like the heating is going up too high, and there's a kind of dining room where there's lots of people there who seem very, very listless and kind of, they don't really know what's going on.
Yeah,
but they're all eating. Yeah.
One thing, hospice is where you go to die, right?
Right.
Okay. I didn't know if it maybe had a slightly different. The definition was slightly different.
That is one. I think that's one meaning. I'm not sure it's the only meaning.
Okay.
Yeah. But he notices these people are sort of dining on some, kind of a lot of food.
Yeah.
And they're curiously chained up right by the ankles.
Oh, that's.
And there's some kind of there's a man who's the kind of the in charge of the establishment, and there's also a woman who we encounters, our businessman, and this is where I guess Aickman shows off his flair for eroticism, and kind of it's not sort of overdone. I mean, he sort of teases you a bit, I think. Which was probably reflective of his generation. He prefers to give you a bit of a tease than to do something too explicit. But anyway, this man ends up staying at this strange place and meeting various characters there, and you kind of ask, what is this place? Has he actually died? Is that he died somehow? Has he crossed into some other realm? So yeah, that's the hospice.
Yeah, of the stories I've read, and I didn't read all 48 of his stories in preparation for this, but the hospice was the one that to me was it wasn't even actually quite my favorite, but it was the most disturbing to me. And I mean, we kind of touched on those reasons why, but that one actually gave me a little bit of the heebie-jeebies. A little bit more so than some of it.
I got the hospice.
Exactly. Well, they're cramming. They're making him eat these huge quantities of food, which is unsettling.
And they're chained up and kind of out of whack. It's interesting because I don't know these stories, and yet Heghoulian, the way you're describing them, they're such powerful little vignettes. Like I can see the turn and I can feel the vibe, but I wonder what the prose is like. I'm going to have to find out. I'm going to have to go and read some Aickman after this.
I would say he's, Aickman is a very literary writer, and the standard of his prose is well above, I would say, the usual horror writer.
I think that's fair.
Writer.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff in there. There's many observations in it about kind of English life of sort of mid 20th century. Quite beyond the sort of supernatural aspects or paranormal aspects. There are many reasons to read Aickman, I think.
And one thing that's interesting, just while we're kind of talking about that I found from a kind of a writerly perspective, how he's accomplishing these effects is, I think part of it is he has this, he's setting you in a very normal scenario, almost a pedestrian kind of lifestyle in a way. Like none of his main characters are extraordinary people or anything. They're sort of just normal. It's like a Twilight Zone episode in that way. Everybody's a 35-year-old middle manager or whatever, and then what makes them unsettling is then, because as soon as you make that surface so conventional, then anything you do to it is a little unnerving, right? You don't have to do a whole lot to make it feel strange and defamiliarized, and I think he's a master of doing that. It's a totally normal summer day, but why is it so quiet? That kind of thing. Right. I was really impressed by that.
I mean, we know a bit about Aickman's views, which you're going to talk about later, but certainly he was very disdainful of, I think, sort of rationalist, attempts to understand the world, really, and particularly the modern fads for explaining things through scientism and so on. And I think his stories have a sort of a purpose in some sense, that he wanted to attack certain things which he didn't like, about the 20th century. And he does that. His voice is always present in the stories, I think, and he doesn't hold back from giving some kind of opinions from time to time.
Right.
And you can sense that they are his opinions.
Yeah. No, and yeah, we'll I mean, maybe now is a good time to just kind of get a little deeper into the biography. And I think maybe we'll kind of pepper in some other short story stuff as we go. So he's born, as you said, 1914, dies in 1981. Just kind of backing up a little bit. I mean, one thing that's interesting about him is his grandfather was Richard Marsh, who was a writer in his own right, who his novel, sort of supernatural horror kind of novel called The Beetle, was published the same year as Bram Stoker's Dracula, but was sold much more than Bram Stoker's Dracula right off the bat. So his Richard Marsh was a bit of a heavy in the genre fiction world. Aickman's father met Richard Marsh at the Continental Club, I believe, or one of these country clubs. Robert Aickman's father was a architect of some renown. He meets Richard Marsh and eventually meets Richard Marsh's daughter, who is, I think, 20 or actually close to 30 years younger than he is. So Aickman's father is 53 or so when when he marries Violet Mabel, and when they have a child. So Robert Aickman starts out, parents are 30 years age difference. His father is a well-known and well-respected architect, but is a man who is rapidly becoming more eccentric, which was pretty interesting. He was like famously late. He would show up 6 hours after a meeting was supposed to happen with no explanation. Right?
They love that in England.
They love it, right? Oh, yeah. Right. And it was one of these marriages. So part of the reason that the marriage happened, there is some lore that Aickman's mother and father basically were intimate one time, and that was when Robert Aickman was conceived. Now, that may be an exaggeration, but usually when that kind of story pops up, it's at least indicative that there wasn't much intimacy, right?
You get called up to the majors.
Yeah.
One time. You're going to pinch hit. Yeah. Bases are loaded.
Right.
Out of the park.
Knock it out of the park.
Grand slam.
Right.
And then they never hear from you again.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
right. Can I say something?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, according to Aickman, Robert Aickman, in his autobiography, the first one, The Attempted Rescue, he says his father was the strangest man he ever knew.
Yes.
And we don't know how much of the autobiography is true, I guess, but he says that his mother, there's a Mabel Violet, that she didn't know how old the father was, Richard. There's a William, how old William was until the wedding day, because he had a curious quality that he was kind of like of no particular age visibly. That he could be any age.
There are people like that, where it's very difficult to tell. Yeah.
And so he never admitted it, right? He never admitted his age, but he was forced to write down his date of birth.
Right.
Could
you imagine? You're 53 years old. Yeah. Well,
this is when you find out.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason that they got married, my understanding from reading this stuff, and there's a few sources we're using here. One is an attempted biography or an attempted autobiography, I guess, which Robert Aickman wrote. Famously left huge gaps in the discussion of his own life. He later wrote another autobiography that famously left other gaps. So it's a little difficult to tell what's real, what's not, what's in the gaps. We also rely on a fairly recent pretty well done biography called An Attempted Biography by R.B. Russell. It's from Tartarus Press, which is that great press that has kind of kept the Robert Aickman story alive. But one thing I kind of gathered from the R.B. Russell biography was that the reason that Robert Aickman's parents got married in some sense was his father, Robert Aickman's father, was a bit of a playboy and was at Richard Marsh's house and kind of just flirted with his daughter. But because of social conventions, you can't just flirt with somebody like brazenly and then just walk away with no entanglements. So the sense that I got was he sort of wasn't particularly interested in her, but kind of set himself up for this by being a cad basically and sort of flirting with her, and then now you basically have to marry her, or you're
it's like Arrested Development. I've made a terrible mistake.
Right. Yeah, he probably just made some comments,
just being friendly.
Right. Right. So inevitably Robert is born. His mother had a rough pregnancy, and he apparently suffered infantile diarrhea so badly that he almost died. His mother was quite ill, and so he had to be bottle fed, and it wasn't a very auspicious beginning for our hero Robert Aickman. The family was, reasonably well off to begin with, but this is 1914. We're headed, very quickly, we're headed into World War I. His father's becoming increasingly eccentric and unprofessional, you might say. So the financial standing and reputational standing of the family is kind of already starting to dwindle. Robert Aickman has, by all accounts, I don't even want to say a normal childhood, but not incredibly remarkable one way or the other. He seemed to play it up later in his own biography and in other places and letters and things that he was, more depressed and distressed than maybe he actually was. It's not clear, but he did end up going to Highgate for high school, which, to my understanding, is, at least at the time and maybe still is, a fairly prestigious boarding school. I don't know where it stands in the English boarding school system in terms of prestige, but it sounded like it's at least in the upper half. I don't know.
May I, maybe Heghoulian can speak to that, but before he does, now, when you say eccentric, you mentioned he would show up late.
Yeah.
Are there any other specific habits? Is it a case where he would wear mismatched jackets? I mean, eccentricity in that period of time, what does that mean exactly? Do you have examples?
Yeah, I mean, Heghoulian might have better ones than I do. I just gathered that he was sort of a guy that was living in his own. He was sort of living in his own head, he was sort of detached from the normal functionings of society. Was what I got out of it. Yeah,
seems like a perfect. Yeah. Go ahead, Heghoulian.
There's one habit which springs to mind, which was that his father, when he got frustrated, when he couldn't find something, there was one thing. For example, he had some kind of piece of wood, which is a bit like worry balls. There's just something he would fiddle with, and this was apparently made specifically for him by a carpenter.
He had a custom designed
block of wood.
Yeah, it's interesting.
He's like the log lady.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
And
one day my log will speak.
Right.
Yes. And anyway, if he couldn't find this or something else, he would start to sort of growl, like a kind of kind of building growl.
Interesting.
Eventually get kind of like turn into a roar, really.
Where's my log?
Where's my wood?
Yeah.
Wow.
Now this sounds kind of too bizarre to make up for me, but
yeah, it does, right? Yeah. You wouldn't. That's interesting.
Now, this Highgate school is north of Camden Town in London. Is this the same one? Is this the school?
I imagine it probably is. Yeah, I would think so. He went during the week and then came home on the weekends. Was how that was for him.
Administration, history, sexual abuse allegations.
Yes.
Yes.
That's a good one. That's like the second item on your Wikipedia page.
As one does. Yeah, great. Well, so this is interesting. Let me go down this a little bit. I mean, my God. I mean, this is what being an American does to your brain, right? You start reading the history and it's like in April of 1563,
right?
You just go like, what? I mean, an expansion of the school occurred in 1838. I mean, like, okay, anyway. Yeah, so this is an old Tony school.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so he did fairly well there, and he started to get kind of introduced to literature and things like that. Now, there's some preoccupations that Aickman had as a teenager that I want to talk about because I think they're very illuminating for his later careers. He had a couple of different complex fantasies in which he basically occupied, especially during adolescent years. One was a complicated political daydream involving 3 or 4 imaginary nations in East Africa, for which he had ceremonies, political systems, transportation systems, etc. So he's playing SimCity in his head, right? There was another one about a cultural suburb of London that he called Beaton that had 4 theaters, one of which he owned, and where he would then put on shows that featured him that had, but he figured it all out from like the ticketing system to the public transportation and that sort of thing. And then he just generally would do elaborate transportation planning sort of in his head as like a fantasizing daydream, right? So he's like a proto urban planner almost. Like he's thinking he thinks at the scale of the municipal or the civic in some way. Which is an interesting setup for a writer, right? Doesn't immediately make you think, oh yeah, this guy's going to write weird stories. But I think we will get there. So he graduates from high school and doesn't do anything at first. He doesn't go on to university. He sort of tries to take up the architecture thing from his father for a little while, but doesn't really pursue it far enough to really make a go of it. He does have what at the time are delusions about his leadership capabilities. He writes a philosophical treatise. I think it's in his early 20s, called Panacea, which, you're 22, and you write a treatise that's, is posed to explain it all, right? Chances are it doesn't really explain all that much, but it does sort of indicate his tendency to try and put thoughts on paper. It does seem to indicate that he's pretty well read. He's, and that's a trait that, you can use to characterize him throughout his life. But he's starting to kind of develop these tendencies. One kind of quote that I think is interesting to put in the mouth of this kid that comes out of a really good school, whose father was successful but is now kind of crazy, and he doesn't really know what he wants to do with his life, but he has these societal level fantasies. He says, "One is born happy or unhappy, just as one is born successful or unsuccessful." So that's sort of his take, one of his takes. He will often talk about, he often referred to, like, once he got out of Highgate, he was just sort of thrown out into the world to like make it on his own, which is totally not true. He was basically given his father's estate and an allowance.
He's one of these Brooklyn trust fund LARPers.
Right.
It's so hard for me. Daddy only gives me $4,000 a month. Right.
So I don't know what the dollar figure was, but apparently it was enough. If you really clipped your coupons, you could get by on. And then he was given the home, his father's home, to live in. called Langdon Lodge. His father had been in surgery and then had never really moved back in, was just kind of bouncing around between the Constitutional Club and these various other places. Oh, I actually do have it. He was living off of 100 pounds a week in today's dollars, apparently. So I don't know. That's not a whole lot, but apparently it was enough. He was going to the theater and the opera basically every night, and he developed a proclivity, Aickman did, for Wagner. He was, and we all know what that means. He's clearly a Nazi.
Brad, say it after me. Say, please, my friend, please say Wagner.
Wagner. No,
Wagner.
See, if I say Wagner, then I'm a Nazi.
Wagner.
No.
Oh my God.
I know it's Wagner. I
want to apologize for my co-host, Heghoulian. Yeah.
Just mention his mum, actually, because his mum is pretty important. Mabel. She was the one who had the ambition for him to be a writer. Mm-hmm. She taught him to read, and he could read by the age of 4. And she got him into to writing, really. Obviously, I think inspired by Marsh, that she had those kind of ambitions for him. And she left the family when he was a teenager.
Yes, right.
She just had enough, basically, of the father.
Yeah.
They split. Can't imagine why with the random growling.
Right. And just and they never loved each other anyway. 30 years of age difference, all this. Yeah. One thing of note about her, just since we're talking about her, she apparently died in the bombing of London during World War II. Aickman was an attempted biography says is that he was visiting her, but he had gone out for a walk or something when a bomber, a German bomber just unloaded some extra payload or something like that and bombed her house while she was basically sitting there waiting for Robert to come back from his walk.
That's what you get for listening to that much Wagner.
That's right. He drew it to you. Now, here's the thing. Aickman did not serve in World War II, even though he would have been of age. And the reason why was he was a conscientious objector. And he, despite the fact that very few people were full on conscientious objectors. So apparently how this would work was there was like tiers. So like you could object on some grounds and get out of like frontline combat duty, but you would still have to go and do something, right? Drive an ambulance, whatever. They would find some non-combat role for you to do. He was one of a much smaller group that got out completely. And he, in part, did it with this application letter that relied heavily on sort of Christian morality, which is interesting because he doesn't really indicate a strong faith in any other aspect of his life, right? So it's not a
little bit of flim-flammery here. He used his writing to avoid the Great War, the World War II. Fascinating.
Exactly.
You know what film I watched recently, which is quite good? A Bridge Too Far. Have you seen this?
I'd never seen that.
A cavalcade of talent. Some of the greatest actors of the 20th century are in this movie, and for some reason, it flew under my radar for a long time. It makes Saving Private Ryan look like a cartoon. It's really? Very, very good.
Huh. Highly recommend. What year are we talking? I
think it was made in the 70s, but it's a World War II film.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. I will have to check that out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he's one thing he also relied on in his conscientious, I can't say that word, objector application. I can't say those two words together. He also referred to his panacea, his philosophical treatise, and basically talked about it, how it was, how much of his discussion in that document was about sort of nonviolence and against conflict and things. But apparently when you actually read Panacea, which I did not do, admittedly, it isn't really about that at all. So you're right, Kevin, very much flim-flam to get out of the war. But he might have had other reasons, which we're going to see other reasons to be out of the war, which we'll see in a little bit. So let's give a little so people can maybe picture him. Let's give a little image of what Robert Aickman looked like. This is according to Elizabeth Jane Howard, who would be his intimate and friend and a collaborator in many ways. Robert was unprepossessing. What's going on with me, Kevin? He had thick, horn-rimmed spectacles through which his small brown eyes looked out with an almost cynical intelligence. Thick brown hair scraped back from his forehead and held firmly in place with a good deal of Brill cream. He had a large but not insensitive mouth and a pale, almost colorless complexion. He had beautiful hands and a voice whose tone implied with some irony that he thought little of anything apart from the arts. So that's him. He's a little bit of a he was definitely involved in the art scene, and before he even had any success as a writer, he sort of posed himself in that world. He was going to the theater all of the time. There was a place he would go to called Covent Gardens,
Covent Garden.
Okay. Yeah. See, man, who knows what I'm pronouncing?
I went over to London many years ago to prepare for the podcast.
Yes.
We're gonna go to London someday, Brad. They're gonna do one of my plays again over there. Okay. We're gonna go over. We'll do an Art of Darkness episode while we're there. It's gonna be great. And
I'm into it.
We will mispronounce every single neighborhood in.
No, I will. I will, and you can just roll your eyes.
That's fine, man. You're good. You're good. Yeah. You're good. You're doing a great job, man.
I did do the Wagner one on purpose, though, because I knew that would drive you nuts.
Wagner the dog here with Brad.
Yeah. All right. So this is something interesting about the whole. Wait, you said it's Covent?
Covent. It's where the opera. I think the opera's there. It's very central. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's right in the West End. The theater's all around there. It's a really central part of London.
It sounded really cool in this discussion. It sounds like it's like it was. I mean, he was going there to the theater all the time, but it ended up becoming this like social club that he was participating in. Almost, it was very cool. One guy that he came to be friends with there is somebody named. I'm going to mispronounce this because I've never heard anybody say any of these, half of these words. Count Pataki de Montauk. Have you ever heard of this guy?
Sounds like a mouthful.
Okay, he is.
Okay. Was he Polish?
He was. I believe he was born in Polish. Yes, he was. He was a pretender to the Polish throne.
So it was probably Potocki then.
Potocki? Oh, okay. See, I figured I was pronouncing that part wrong. For sure. Okay, so he's if you go on Wikipedia, he's described as he's got a great sort of slug line about who, one sentence description of what he is: poet, polemicist, pagan, and pretender to the Polish throne, which I think is great.
Sounds like Kanye lyrics.
Right. And I just wanted to sideline talk about him for a second because he's interesting. This guy was in 1932 was imprisoned for 6 months because he brought a manuscript to a publisher. He'd done these erotic translations of Rabelais, and the publisher knew they were obscene and turned him in. One of them was a poem that he'd either written or he'd inserted in amongst the others called "Lament for Sir John Penis." He's just this crazy dude. But he did have support from Virginia, from the Woolfs, Virginia Woolf and her husband, and some others. But he was also a big supporter of Sir Oswald Mosley. He believed in the protocols of the elders of Zion, and that sort of thing. He started a journal called The Right Review, which Aickman thought was, quote, a fun read. And it included, the first issue of The Right Review included a statement of Potocki's position, call it a manifesto, I suppose. And I'm going to give you a quote. I think this guy's great. I'm going to do an episode on him one day. It is our aim to show that the divine right of kings is the sanest and best form of government, being in the last resort the only fount of power and consequently of human life. We intend to prove that such government is intensely beneficial to the whole human race, including the lowest races of mankind. In this way, we hope to provide the right wing with a living ideology. Somebody's been listening to Curtis Yarvin. I was going to say, I think Curtis Yarvin might have been listening to Count Potocki. So anyway, that's one of the people in the sort of the young, we're talking, Aickman's 20 something. This is one person that he knows and is in his social milieu. Now there's another thing that starts going on too, and we're going to talk about this more in the After Dark episode. So Aickman writes these supernatural stories. They're descendants of what were called ghost stories. Now, we're familiar with ghost stories as being, that's what you tell around the campfire. But if you want to be specific about it, it's actually a genre of literature. And, there are people like Oliver Onions, some other people I've highlighted on the Twitter over the last couple of weeks, who are writing effectively ghost stories. They were kind of gothic. Some of them had kind of Victorian aesthetics to them. Aickman was in that lineage, but wasn't strictly writing those kinds of stories. They weren't, maybe they were maybe about ghosts, right? It wasn't clear what was always happening in a Robert Aickman story. But Aickman was very interested in the paranormal and the supernatural. Unlike a lot of writers in these sort of genres, like we saw purportedly H.P. Lovecraft was just a stark materialist atheist, right? That is probably the more common perspective for a writer in these genres. Aickman actually believed in this stuff, or wanted to believe. He would join, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in the After Dark, he would join the Society for Psychical Research, which is an entity started in England, still exists, has existed for like 140 years, investigating ghosts and psychics and all those kinds of things. So we're going to have some fun with that in the After Dark. So Aickman joins that in 1939 and is somewhat involved with it for a number of years. Another thing he gets involved in, and this is probably his biggest thing, this is what he's most known for, other than writing, is something called the Inland Waters Association. So the Inland Waters Association, so I guess the thing to understand is like there's all these canalways, man-made canals in England. And
yes, and many people actually have boats that they live on in these canals, and they move them around the country. It's quite fascinating.
Yes. Now, Robert Aickman is instrumental to the fact that is actually still happening.
Is that right?
Yeah. So that was a kind of a way of life in, up until the late 19th century into the 20th century. But with the war and the changing nature of commercialism, of commerce, the canals had sort of fallen into disrepair. Many of them were owned by the railway, or the various railroad companies, and they had sort of let them fall apart. And it was a kind of a lifestyle that was sort of passing. Now, Robert Aickman, remember, he's a boy who grew up fantasizing about transportation systems, right? This is a thing that he's fascinated by and he loves. He decides along with this guy, Tom Rolt, who is another writer, but was a writer who kind of at times focused on stories sort of set in the canalway system. They form this association called the Inland Waters Association. It starts very, very, very small, and actually grows to be a pretty major effort. Aickman his second autobiography was all about what his time in the Inland Waters Association, making this effort to restore the inland waterways, canals, and so forth, of England, the boating lifestyle. He loved all of this stuff, right?
Maybe I could jump in.
Yeah, please tell us. Right. Talk about that.
Yeah, how did he get into that? How did he meet Rolt? Well, I think in sort of early 40s maybe, Aickman read a book by Rolt called Narrowboat, which was an account of one of Rolt's kind of canal journeys with his wife. And the canals at that time were kind of in disrepair, and there were parts of the canals which were kind of not navigable really. But anyway, Rolt was into this, and so Aickman was fascinated by this topic really, and he got in touch with Rolt, And of course they hit it off, although they had a few differences of opinion. And as you say, they created. It was actually, I think, Inland Waterways Association.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, Waterways. Yep. I think it was 1946, I believe.
That was their first meeting. Was 1946. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So they created it, and Aickman was kind of a bossy character. He wanted himself to be, he wanted to be the chairman. Rolt was kind of like his partner, but they didn't see eye to eye on everything.
Rolt was a lot more laid. I mean, his contributions were huge, but he seemed like a little bit more of a laid back character.
Right. Yeah. They had a few differences of opinion politically. I think Rolt was also kind of right winger, but he had a bit more sympathy with the working class, which is kind of obvious if you read his book Narrowboat. And he wanted the canals to sort of be commercially viable, really. He wanted them to pay their way, and so he wanted to concentrate on those canals which were commercially viable. But Aickman thought, every single mile canal had to be saved. Right? So this eventually led to a falling out, and Rolt was expelled by Aickman. But Aickman was, he was incredibly hardworking in the IWA. He did most of the writing of the publications, I think. And it's interesting in his first autobiography, he gives the sort of reason why he wanted to set this up. This whole, not only the association, but the kind of lifestyle which it led to, of kind of regattas and journeys on the canals and so on. And he said he conceived of it, or he and his friends really conceived of it as a redoubt, as a fortress in a sense, because he could see around him really England kind of being transformed, especially after the war. I mean, it's accelerated really under the Labour government. It transformed in ways he didn't like. So he didn't like, the kind of advance of socialism and bureaucracy, of what he thought of as kind of more conformism and, sort of lowering of ambition as he saw it, and sort of encroachment of industry and urbanism really on things. So and the kind of increase of the pace of life, and sort of more, as he saw it, more vulgarity and so on. Yeah. So he wanted to create this kind of zone, really, this kind of space where something different could happen, really. And
it was a bit of a fantasy, though, really, right? I mean,
maybe,
yeah. I mean, in terms of it, they did end up having some successes for sure, but I think at least some of his friends, some of his intimate female friends would describe it as like Aickman wanted to live in a world where we all floated around on gondolas, and we got around in the Venetian way, sort of, right? It's a little unrealistic, but
to be fair though, I think he was pretty lucid, and he was.
Well, he was certainly effective. It wasn't pie in the sky, but it was maybe an unrealistic goal in some ways.
I think he had like a sort of Oswald Spengler type of, vision, right? Where the modern world was just going to kind of advance and everything was going to get worse and worse. And he didn't see, that being preventable really, but he wanted to kind of carve out a space, I think, where this would be held off for some time, the changes would be held off for some time.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, he was very, very lucid, really, and perceptive.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And yeah, I didn't mean to dismiss it entirely. I think one thing that was sort of interesting about he had this attitude that he had a very uncompromising attitude. So he thought within the IWA and in terms of getting membership and things like that, that if you didn't disagree with his vision, his time and energy would be better spent finding people who did agree with him than trying to figure out how to compromise with you. Right. It was like, just get out of the way. You're on let's all be on the exact same page, which is my page. And, and if you're not, then you go find another, organization to be a part of or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
May I ask, Heghoulian, can I interject, Brad?
Is that okay? Absolutely.
Yeah. Heghoulian, I've always wondered this, and I don't have a sense of it as an American. What is the impression of people who now, today in 2022, live on these boats and move these boats up and down? Is there a culture of this? I mean, is there anything comparable that an American could maybe latch on to?
Well, I think to own a boat like that and to run it, you have to be fairly well off these days.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that wasn't always the case. I mean, I did read somewhere, I can't remember where it was, but in the 19th century, when the railways were, kind of coming in, then a lot of those canal workers who were just working class people, really, they ended up, of course, without a livelihood. And some of them ended up living on their boats, kind of like gypsies, And they decorated their boats sort of colorfully, and they just lived on those, kind of traveling around from town to town, picking up work where they could. But in the sort of more recent times, I mean, it's much more of a kind of upper middle class, maybe hobby, this sort of kind of narrow boating. And you can, I mean, thanks largely to Aickman, to some extent, Roald, you can actually navigate the whole of, the UK through the canals.
Yeah, I briefly stayed adjacent to one. And it's a very particular mood, and it ran by the pub, and it just creates a whole vibe. And then you see these people in their boats, and I just had that kind of fascination of somebody who is like, "Wow, what a lifestyle! How strange is this? But are you just gonna like move along down the line? I mean, it's just very kind of unique and interesting."
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, in the second autobiography that he wrote, it's called The River Runs Uphill. Aickman said some interesting things about canals. Like he saw canals as extending green fingers into towns. Mm-hmm. So now he was always one for the countryside, really, against the town. He wasn't really a fan of towns and cities. And he writes a bit there about, as you say, the atmosphere, the kind of unique atmosphere, the feeling of being in a slightly different realm, on the canal. And I think this is, we talk about his I don't know, his religion, as you were saying, he's not Christian, but he was definitely kind of religious in sensibility. But it was much more that he was, kind of fascinated by nature, by mysteries. He was kind of into astrology.
He was sort of a romantic. Is that fair to say, do you think?
I think so. Capital R, basically.
Right. Yeah. Well, is one thing, he has a couple of stories that sort of, because in part of his IWA work, he would go and try to navigate canals, either to sort of assess them or just in terms of they would do these opening celebrations and things like that. And then he wrote, some of his stories are around this, right? Isn't the trains... Is that one? Which one? Is it the trains? There's one that is focused on this. I know there's one. There's a story in the compulsory games volume called something a wind. That's all about this. Raising the Wind. That's about two guys taking a sort of dilapidated boat up canal to a spot where they're going to repair it, and they do a kind of a witchy crone beckons them into this church to do a ritual that will bring the wind and allow them to travel.
I haven't read that one, but you've read all the compulsory games stories.
Yeah. So this would leak into his stories too. And there was the first book that he ever put out, which was with Elizabeth Jane Howard. These were two. There was 6 stories. Each of them wrote three stories. there was a story she wrote about being on the canals because she was also involved in the IWA. He sort of helped to get her published, and then she was involved in the IWA. They were lovers. She eventually would leave him and marry Kingsley Amis, which is pretty interesting. It's just sort of it's a small world, I suppose. But kind of maybe to kind of close out not necessarily close out, but sort of indicate where the IWA stuff went. I mean, it starts with Rolt and Aickman. They add a couple of their friends, and eventually it's got hundreds of members. He's putting on this bulletin all the time. Eventually, he's organizing an orchestra to travel up and down now, here's one, Kevin. How do I say this? Thames.
The Thames?
The Thames, Brad. I was on mute. I'm just the Thames.
I know that.
Brad.
I know that one.
Oh, we've got to
that
get
one.
Oh, okay. You're just torturing us now.
I am. I'm just messing with you.
Okay.
Well, howdy. Can you tell me how to get to the Thames River?
So he organized an orchestra to travel up and down the barge to sort of popularize the canal waterways. He organized a fair that was apparently very successful, that was partially based in the water, where all the boats kind of arrived. He met Queen Elizabeth at one point when they were opening, I believe, the Stratford Canal in the 60s. He had a lock named after him. I think it maybe still exists. It does, according to the R.B. Russell biography, the Robert Aickman lock. I believe it's on the Upper Avon. And so we don't want to get into. I don't want to get into all of this sort of the battles between governmental organizations and all of that. It's pretty interesting. But we want to talk a little bit more about his writing and the rest of his life. But I think I came away from this thinking that if it wasn't for Robert Aickman, there's a very good chance that there would be little to no sort of inland waterways culture there. Is that fair to say, Heghoulian?
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly if somebody had taken that up, instead of him, I don't think they would have done it with quite as much gusto.
Right. Right.
And he does kind of boast about it in his autobiography in a sort of ironic ways. He's talking about when I saved the waterways.
Right. There's some myth making there for sure. But he did. I mean, to start an organization from nothing and get hundreds of people involved, and that's no mean feat. No matter what you're trying to do.
Right. But the relationship with Rolt is kind of interesting because LTC Rolt published a book of his own kind of ghost stories, supernatural stories, I think in the late 40s, and it's called Sleep No More. And these stories were kind of, the theme here was that the stories all took place around kind of industrial environments, like mines and foundries and things like that. And anyway, Aickman hadn't yet written any stories, but I mean, this is maybe an indication of the kind of relationship they had, but he decided he wanted to try and do better, than
Right. Very
so that's how We Are for the Dark, the volume with Elizabeth Jane Howard, who was, I mean, if you don't know who she was a kind of extraordinarily beautiful woman. You can see why Aickman fell for her, really. And Aickman also thought she had some kind of psychic gift.
Yes. And one of the small handful of quote unquote supernatural experiences that Aickman had was he saw her in a mirror, and she appeared as an old woman in the mirror, and he sort of at the time asked her if she saw it too, and she said that she did. And so that was like what Aickman referred to, sort of as my understanding, is his closest brush with the paranormal, was this moment where they looked in the mirror, and it inspired a story that he wrote called Le Mirror, or something like that. And so that was, that was the love of his life, I think, was Elizabeth Jane Howard. He was married to a woman before he met her named Ray. There's some correspondences in that relationship he had with Ray to his parents' relationship, and that it was somewhat on the loveless side, maybe not to the same degree as Aickman's parents, but there was the sense that Aickman wasn't really the marrying type, and he kind of put himself in this situation, somewhat a marriage of convenience. They never had children, but it was made problematic for a few reasons. One, Aickman liked women as friends, and as lovers as well. So throughout his life, he had very few close male friends and a great number of close female friends. So that's one thing that makes a marriage difficult.
Well, that makes sense. If your father is the strangest man you've
right.
ever known, you maybe just
yeah.
gravitate toward the ladies.
Yep. Exactly. So he would have a number of love affairs, but he would also have just like a lot of women kind of around, that he would take to the theater, but there wasn't, he wasn't necessarily romantically entangled with them.
But apparently Ray, kind of didn't object to this. They had some kind of open relationship. Now, I don't know if she really was happy with that.
Right. Yeah. No, there's actually a letter that Ray writes to Elizabeth Jane Howard that, I actually had it here, but it was something to that effect of like, yes, I understand what's going on here. And, it's not necessarily excited about it, but she certainly knew that Robert was stepping out.
So wandering the canals.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Wandering the canals with Robert Aickman.
Aickman actually mentioned something about children in his autobiography, the first one.
Oh, he does.
That he was writing in the 60s, late 60s, and he was saying that children today have placed so many demands on their parents that it's not worth it. That's how he saw things. Now, maybe that was a bit of cope. I don't know.
Right.
But there was another acquaintance of his who claimed, I can't remember who it was, but who claimed that he hated children. He actively hated them. So there was a kind of like definitely a dark side to Aickman, kind of unpleasant side to him. Not the only side, I think.
Yeah, and this is probably a good segue is to get into what we'll call the problematic Robert Aickman. He wasn't just friends with this pretender to the Polish throne and thought that he was a fun guy. He was, I think it's fair to say that he was an elitist. I don't think even he would have disagreed with that term. He kind of appreciated in various writings hereditary principles rather than election. I think he was maybe calling him a monarchist is a little bit too far, but it's not that far off of the mark. He believed that voters should have to pass a general knowledge test and own property before they vote, which not everybody disagrees with that, I don't think. And he was, I think it's also fair to say that he was a fascist sympathizer. His favorite film is by Leni. I am not mispronouncing this on purpose. Leni Riefenstahl. Is that fair? Riefenstahl. His favorite film.
I was exaggerating.
the Blue Light by her. For people who don't know,
you could do a lot worse than appreciate the filmmaking of Leni Riefenstahl. She's somebody
I've never seen it. Yeah.
Well, she made Heghoulian.
Triumph of the Will.
Triumph of the
Will. Is that the Will? Right. Yeah.
But she did. Was that where she did the sports? Is that the sports one?
No. Triumph of the Will is about Hitler's trip.
It's the Nuremberg rally, right?
Nuremberg rally. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. She also filmed the Berlin Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
But the Blue Light. It's actually a really good film. You can watch it on YouTube, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a woman who lives kind of in the mountains, and the villagers down below say she's a witch, and the woman is played by Riefenstahl herself, and she was very beautiful at that time.
Mm-hmm.
In sort of the I think early 30s, like 31. And anyway, there's some kind of material up there, some kind of crystals which emit blue light, and the men from below, I think in the village, become kind of entranced by this, and they start wandering up. I think they fall to their deaths or something like that, right? So this is why the villagers think that she's a witch. But for Aickman, for him, the witch character, or whatever you want to call her, sorceress, was a sympathetic character, and he saw the villagers as kind of just sort of ignorant masses, who didn't understand this mysterious power. So that was why he was, I think, so taken by that.
Yeah, well, and he was. I mean, I think it sounded like he was infatuated with her as a person. He would write her letters, and she would send him photographs and things like that. He also apparently managed to arrange for himself a private screening of Triumph of the Will. So
Lenny is going to be a banger episode. She lived to be 101 years old. She only died in 2003. Yeah. She's a really arch example of people who have, you sort of have to separate her politics and all of that from her contribution to the film art. Right. People really wrestle with her, and Olympia still influences, called Olympia, the way that sports are sort of presented and everything. It's lovely.
Yeah. And I haven't seen any of those films, and from the little reading I did on him, it did sound like she was technically brilliant.
She was a heavy
filmmaker. Yeah. Absolutely. Some other things about Aickman and his politics. It's not. He was a Zionist, so I think anybody who's he declared himself a Zionist. So I think you can't pin the fact that just because he likes the blue light and was in love with Lenny that he was a Nazi. But at the same time, he also was self-proclaimed pro-Franco. He found Mussolini inspiring, and so it's kind of tricky. I don't know. It's tricky. I don't know that it's tricky to locate him necessarily. He doesn't fit. He wouldn't survive, modern Twitter. Actually, maybe he'd be fine.
He'd be purged. Well, that is an interesting. We don't need to dwell too much on this, but is there some sort of philosophical incoherence between fascism and Zionism? Not necessarily.
No. Nazism and Zionism potentially, I would say, are at odds with each other. But yeah. Right.
Yeah. Very interesting. Was he? So he'd be a Tory, right? I mean, he was
I suppose
like a conservative.
Right. Yeah.
I think there's an extra complicating factor though, is that he was kind of skeptical about the sort of cult of masculinity. Really, like there's a story, The Wine Dark Sea, where another kind of nameless protagonist ends up on a Greek island where he's been like a small Greek island out in a bay, where he's been warned not to go. He sort of steals a boat and ends up on there, and he meets these three beautiful women who turn out to be sorceresses, and it seems that they somehow survived from ancient times. And there's a speech that they give where they condemn the Greeks as poisoned by masculinity. So it's kind of interesting what Aickman's attitude really to men actually is kind of complicated.
And he's certainly favored the company of women. And maybe we can talk about that for a minute too. It's his handling of women in his writing can seem, I think, at a surface level reading to be, depending on if you pick up the story Marriage, and that's the only Aickman you've read, you might come across him thinking him maybe not quite misogynistic, but one of these guys who can't write women, right? But then if you pick up Hand in Glove, or another short story where a woman or women are the main characters, he seems like he's handling them from a writer's standpoint very well, and with all due respect and admiration. So he's interesting in that regard. He has But at the same time, at one point he says that they should hire. There's a position open at the IWA after it's grown for a while, where he says, we need to hire somebody for this position within the organization. We should hire a woman because we won't have to pay her as much. So there's which so it's a little bit complicated, right?
Saying the quiet part out loud.
Right. Well,
don't love that.
No.
You mentioned that story of the trains earlier. That was an early one, and that has female main characters, protagonist and her friend, and it also kind of showcases his love for the countryside. I think it's set in the Yorkshire Moors. Okay. And it kind of, when I discovered this story, it sort of reminded me instantly of a painting. I mean, listeners can look this up. They like. It's a painting by someone called James Walker Tucker, 1936, a painting called Hiking. He was one of the British realists of the 30s. That was a kind of movement which just sort of vanished really after the 30s. And it's about two young women, sort of hiking in the Yorkshire Moors. And one thing that sticks in my mind as well is the wonderful descriptions of the weather in that story. And it's remarkable, really, because it was one of the first stories he wrote. But he gets out of the blocks, very fast, we might say. And it's a wonderfully evocative story. And it seems to me that he writes the women there very, very well. I think that they are distinct characters, different types of women recognizably. Right. One of them is rather kind of the protagonist. Actually, she's a bit insecure because the other one she thinks is prettier and sexier than her, and so on. So that the trains is one of these stories which showcases various Aickman-esque elements. And another early story is Your Tiny Hand is Frozen, which deals with really the telephone. I think this is kind of what I would call it, a technological uncanny, and about a character who, like many of Aickman's characters, rather a lonely figure, a man who seems to have split up with his girlfriend, living now in the flat which they used to share, and he begins to be plagued by his telephone. Which is not even his phone, actually, but his girlfriend's phone it was. And
wow, how prescient is that?
Yeah, right.
It sounds like, yes. Go on, Heghoulian. Very interesting.
It starts ringing up at sort of odd times. It could be in the early hours of the morning, and there's nobody on the line. Nobody picks up. And this passes for some months, but eventually, it turns out that there is somebody on the line. And it's a woman. It's a woman, and he ends up in these long conversations with her, and she seems to be, very taken with him. But he finds that when he puts the phone down, after some time has passed, it could be hours, they've been talking. He can't really remember what they were talking about. And then it's more strange things start to happen because he starts to. Well, she phones him always. He doesn't know what her number is. And so he starts staying at home. He's got a job, I think, of a translator. As I remember, he's translating pornographic manuscripts or something from Dutch to English, as I recall. He starts staying at home because he's terrified of missing a call, and that might be the last call from this girl. Right. But then the phone continues to plague him because people start calling up, asking for this corporation. And he doesn't know this corporation. He says, I don't know anything about it,
Right.
Phone someone else. But they keep doing it, Anyway, I'm not going to spoil the story, but it just is a fantastic exploration of how just a simple object like the telephone can be kind of uncanny, really. We've already kind of touched on it. He certainly had reservations and fears about technology. I'm going to give you two quotes that he wrote, not in stories, but elsewhere, that relate to this. One,
quote, "The modern conflict is between man and the machine for mastery. At present, the machine is winning in every department of life and thought, television being without doubt its most dangerous and far-reaching victory." He would never own a television, despite dying in 1981. He would never own a television or a radio. Another quote from him: "Every time you take a television into your house, every time you buy a washing machine or a motor car instead of a Shakespeare or a guitar, you bring 1984 nearer." Right. So he was certainly conscious and concerned about. There was also this interesting, one of the later apartments he lived in, the Barbican, was apparently he lived next door to the telephone exchange, and it was just constantly like making all of the noises it did, in the older phone systems where you had operators and things like that. And apparently it drove him absolutely crazy.
Right.
Yeah. Which I thought was
the Barbican. Yeah. The Barbican is a kind of brutalist monster, really.
Yeah.
And he was kind of forced to move there.
Yeah. And they'd sort of partially, he'd been lured in by these false promises that they were going to build theaters and everything. And then it turned into just being like these concrete projects, what we would call it.
Right. I can't imagine Aickman in the Barbican. It's just unimaginable, really. But, what else was I? Oh, about the machine thing. He kind of had an apocalyptic vision of the machine, really, and its role in history, which he said he took from Samuel Butler, which was a novelist in the 19th century, that Butler saw the machine as an evolutionary development. In other words, it was going to take over from human beings. It was going to replace us, essentially.
Now that's a commonly held view now, isn't it?
But Butler saw this over 100 years ago. Yeah,
the scary thing is now that some of us seem to be cheering it on. It seems to be some encouragement. So let's talk a little bit about where kind of his writing. I want to kind of position what his kind of career ended up being, because he was kind of a late bloomer in terms of actually sitting down to write. I mean, he wrote Panacea, his treatise, very early, and then it took him some number of years to actually sit down and start cranking out the stories that we've come to know as Aickman-esque, these strange stories that have kept his name alive. But once he kind of got going into the 60s, he was starting to get some attention, partially because he was collecting. He became the editor of an annual series of ghost stories, basically, where he would select the stories that would go into it, from everybody from D.H. Lawrence to Edgar Allan Poe to the speculative fiction writers of his day, and then he would always put one of his stories in there. I think it's the Fanta. I had it right here. The Fanta. Anyway, it was an annual sort of anthology collection of sort of spooky stories, if you will, but often from very, very well-known and writers that are still read today. It was sort of a couple notches past the pulp, I would say. And then eventually he did start getting published in America, really starting in the 70s. He started getting picked up by Arkham House, which was the publishing house that kind of came out of the attempts to further H.P. Lovecraft's work after he had passed. And in 1975, he was actually invited to the World Fantasy Conference to be given an award for best short fiction. This happened in Providence, so this is like Lovecraft is now kind of come though it's long after Lovecraft's death, he's kind of come into renown. Aickman doesn't end up traveling to the United States for this. It was his sort of closest he ever came to visiting America, but he got I thought this was funny. He got his trophy. So they shipped him his trophy for best short fiction that year. And the trophy was this bulbous caricature of H.P. Lovecraft. And so he sort of broke it off of the plaque and threw that away and just kept the plaque that said, World Fantasy Conference best short fiction. I thought that was charming. He 76, he was a guest of honor at the British Fantasy Society, and he at this point he had enough success writing, and he'd had a success with the IWA, that his snobbishness had sort of reached its ultimate state, and so he was a little bit overdressed. He looked down his nose a little bit at people. If people asked him, hey, what other writers of contemporary short story or contemporary ghost stories or that kind of thing should I read, he would dismiss the whole thing. So he ends up it's funny because he was such a learned, he's such a well-read guy. He was very, very intelligent. He was an accomplished writer. But because he was writing in this genre, mostly because there was nowhere else to put him, his contemporaries ended up being, to some degree, sort of pulp writers. And I think I got the sense, kind of reading between the lines, that this was a little bit of a, I don't know if I want to say disappointment, but it was an awkward position for him to be in, right? It didn't naturally fit his sort of vibe. Now, 1980 comes along. He's publishing short story collections to varying degrees of success throughout the 60s and 70s. As we hit 1980, he gets cancer. And there's this interesting thing that sort of happens. So, like I said, we're going to talk more about a little bit more about his interest in the spooky. We're going to talk about the Society for Psychical Research and some other things in the After Dark. That's patreon.com/artofdarkpod. But one thing we can say here is he gets cancer and he doesn't get it treated. He does what Steve Jobs did. He does the sort of alternative medicine thing. He goes the homeopathic route. He gets injections of mistletoe at one point, which who knows? Maybe that could work. I have no idea. But one thing I want to kind of position here. So I ended up kind of, and this was interesting topic for me. This is an episode we did where I started knowing almost basically nothing about him. So I ended up sort of pushing against him because I felt like he was pretentious and elitist, but I also felt I really did appreciate him and liked him at the end. And I think one way we can see this is, throughout his life, after he divorces Ray, he has all of these women friends. And he could be a little controlling, or he could be a little jealous. Like, he would have a female friend that he wasn't intimate with, and then she would get married and he would cut her off completely, which maybe is the appropriate thing to do. But he had these sort of friction. There was friction in these relationships he had. One other thing he did is he kept all of these women separate. It wasn't like he was friends with a whole group of women. He was friends with these individual women who he had a one-to-one relationship with. But as he started to get sicker and sicker in 1980 and into 1981, these women, including Elizabeth Jane Howard, who had left him, they started kind of to take turns taking care of him. And at this point, they all started to meet each other, which I thought was really interesting. Some of these women he'd known for decades, some of them like Jean Richardson, who was the closest thing he had to a partner or a girlfriend or whatever you want to say for the last sort of phase of his life. They all started to meet each other. And I just think this is sort of, you think about a person dying, he was 68 years old, a person dying with no children and no family, not married, parents not around, no siblings, what happens to them? And it was just interesting to see that these women kind of cared about him enough or were friends enough with him that they came to look out for him. And that made me think that he really must have had something, a charisma, which I think is true. And I want to, we'll talk a little bit more, but I kind of maybe want to close the narrative of his life with something that I think is really quite lovely. This was from, I believe this is from Jean Richardson, who was quite a bit younger than him and was sort of his last quote unquote girlfriend. When we went to a house and a garden, we had to be open to everything and we had to see everything. Her and Aickman, she's saying. There aren't many people who go around looking at all those showcases. He loved the odd little details. I suspect that some of the details in his stories, the odd names, came from things he had noticed. It was the same when we went around a church or churchyard. He would be reading all the tombs and epitaphs. Robert's attitude towards everything creative, whether it was books, houses, or films, or opera, or ballet, was not quite the modern one where people are often doing something else at the same time or they don't take it too seriously. Robert gave all of himself to everything like that he went to. He gave, I sometimes felt, to artistic things the same level of dedication that he put into writing. He put all of himself into his writing, and he paid the artist or the composer the same compliment. He put all of himself into their work. He opened up to whatever it had to offer. And that seems like a pretty cool way to live to me. So I admire that and many other things about him. He did die in 1981 from cancer in a homeopathic hospital, never having really sought what we would consider proper treatment. But, you know, might have gotten to him anyway. He apparently was kind of concerned about chemotherapy. He didn't want to lose his hair. But yeah, that's it. He had very detailed instructions, as you can imagine, for his funeral, what was to happen to his things. All of his friends got something bequested to them, whether it was a book or a piece of furniture or whatever it was. Yeah. And that's the life of Robert Aickman.
I think that was great. I have two things to add from the Wikipedia that I think might be of interest that I've been looking at.
Yeah.
Aickman has a blue plaque at 11 Gower Street, which is right near the British Museum, an area that I know very well in Bloomsbury.
That was his apartment for years and years and years, where he did his first writing and where he basically launched. That was the early offices of the Inland Waterways Association.
Yes, and it appears that the blue plaque was put up there by the Inland Waterways Association.
Okay.
And there's a quote from him in response to receiving a World Fantasy Award. He wrote this, may I?
Yeah, absolutely.
He said, I believe in what the Germans term Ehrfurcht, reverence for things one cannot understand. Faust's error was an aspiration to understand and therefore master things which by God or by nature are set beyond the human compass. He could only achieve this at the cost of making the achievement pointless. Once again, it is exactly what modern man has done. I believe in life after death, and I decline to particularize upon the meaning of the words, because of all futile and reductionist attempts at definition, this is the most idle. Most of my stories aim at universal themes, however difficult it may be to attain them. Very cool.
Yeah,
well, cool. Let's wind down with the classic Art of Darkness question for our friend Heghoulian. Heghoulian, thank you for joining the pod. Yes. Friend of the show. We're very grateful. And I will put a link to your Bird website account in the show notes at artofdarkpod.com. Heghoulian, what do you think Mr. Aickman would be doing now if he was still kicking?
I don't know. I think he would be kind of disgusted with the world, first of all. But probably he'd still be writing. I think he would be writing. He did write a couple of novels. One was The Late Breakfasters, which was before really he became famous for the strange stories in the mid-60s.
This is sort of a comedy of manners a little bit, wasn't it? Or
yeah, kind of a bit out of his usual kind of line, really. And the other one is called The Model, which is set in Tsarist Russia. I haven't read that actually, but he had a very high opinion of it. He thought it was perhaps the best thing he'd ever done. It was published in the later 80s. But I mean, if people want to get into Aickman, you could do worse than the audiobooks. Like I said, the Reese Shearsmith audiobooks, which I found invaluable, really, because I sort of got into Aickman when our first child was born. Didn't have a lot of time just to sit down with a book, but I could listen to the audiobook while I was looking after the baby.
And I think these stories are particularly well suited to audiobooks. They're short stories, first of all, so you can kind of take them, in one go. But also the atmosphere of them, I think, is particularly good when they're well read. So
right, yeah, and Shearsmith does a bang-up job, really. So there are three collections that he did. I think it's The Wine Dark Sea, The Unsettled Dust, and Cold Hand in Mine. There is another book which was put out by, I think it's Faber, a few years ago, which is Dark Entries, which contains a few classic stories as well. And then there was the Compulsory Games collection, which came out, I think, about 4 years ago.
Yeah,
which is also good.
Yeah.
I think there's not a bad book he's ever been put out really under Aickman's name. All of them are great. So you can start anywhere really.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
I think maybe he'd have an Anon account posting return stuff. Maybe monarchy. Standing the monarchy.
He might be. Yeah.
Who knows? Very interesting fellow.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's all I've got.
Hey, we're going to come back for the
After Dark for sure. Yes.
Theremin noises After Dark for the Patreon subscribers. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Brad, great job. Heghoulian, thank you for coming on the show again. We'll have you back. Brad, any final words? Okay, because I'm going to finish this with a moan. You ready?
Yeah.
I lost.
Your William Aickman moan.
Thanks again, Heghoulian. We'll see you on the Bird website.
Thank you very much, boys.
Thank you. Please subscribe to his Substack. Go to his Twitter account and subscribe. All right. Take care, y'all. See you on the After Dark.
Bye-bye.
Bye.